Hello everyone and welcome back to another session of Elden Ring PvP and another weapon showcase. Today we are taking a look at the Dark Moon Greatsword. This is a weapon that you get from completing Ranni's quest by getting engaged, and I have to say the more I use this weapon, the more I dislike it, because I cannot help but compare it to its previous iterations, and in comparison to all of them, this one is a disappointment. Getting started with the basics of the weapon. It requires 16 strength, 11 dexterity, and 38 faith to wield, and it weighs 10 units. The skill of the weapon is Moonlight Greatsword, and you're stuck with it because it is a somber weapon. At plus 10, it has a physical base damage of 200, a magic base damage of 240, a D scaling in strength, D in dexterity, and B in intelligence. It will deal 55 frostbite per hit, and with that all said, that's all of the basics on this thing. The big pro of the weapon is, of course, the damage. With that damage, you'll be able to deal with your opponents pretty quickly when you're able to hit them. The moveset, for the most part, is pretty standard. Your R2s are a bit unique, but we'll get into that in a minute. The R1s are the same old clunky greatsword moveset that we all know and tolerate. It would have been nice if there were some variety with it, but it is what it is. With your R2s, whether you are one-handed or two-handed, whether you are buffed or not, they'll go through the same animation, and that is kind of a shame because when you are unbuffed, you will not shoot out a beam, but you'll still have that same slow, pretty useless attack, to be perfectly honest. So it is what it is. The skill of the weapon is pretty good overall. It does let you shoot out the beams, so it is quite crucial to your success with this weapon. It will add 65 magic damage and 15 frostbite, build up to your attacks, and it lasts 60 seconds. So with this skill, only the skill itself when you buff the weapon costs FP. The beams themselves on your R2s do not. With the beams, you can charge them, and they are unaffected by the Axe Talisman in spite of the fact that they are a charged R2 attack. Instead, they are actually affected by Godfrey's icon. Now that said, if you are limited to 2 talisman slots, I would recommend picking the Shard of Alexander and the Blue Scorpion Charm, because the Blue Scorpion Charm, in comparison to a fully charged R2 with the Godfrey icon, only lets you deal a little bit less damage. It, from what I was able to see in my testing, ended up being less than 100 damage different, which isn't that big of a deal. And the fact that the Blue Scorpion Charm will impact the rest of your moveset, I would recommend it because it ends up being more valuable overall. Now, if you can afford to have 3, then the Shard of Alexander, Blue Scorpion Charm, and Godfrey Icon will all stack with each other, and they will all benefit from, having each other on. Your damage will basically go through the roof if you're able to land a fully charged R2 well buffed. So keep that in mind when you're using this thing. It's hard to do, but if you can manage it, you can one-shot people, so it is what it is. A couple of other things to keep in mind, of course. With this weapon, you can always increase the damage further by using your Physic, or using Terra Magica. That will increase the damage of the beams on this weapon as well. So if you can place that on the ground and get your fully charged R2 off while stacking on all 3 of those talismans, you're going to be in very good shape. Unless, of course, your opponent used a spell-proof Dread Liver or whatever the spell version of that is, in which case you'll still deal significant damage because you won't one-shot them, but you'll still deal well in excess of 600, 700 if you have all of those buffs and things on. So keep that in mind. Now, the cons of this weapon. To be perfectly honest, it pales in comparison to the previous iterations of the weapon. I would say that this version of it is most similar to the Moonlight Greatsword of Dark Souls 1, because your R2 is a simple beam, there's no thrusting stab, and that's kind of the weapon in a nutshell. With this, though, in comparison, it doesn't have an explosion on its beam when that beam collides with an object or the ground. And because of that, it's very limiting If this weapon had an explosion Dark Souls 1 style, it would be a much better, much more viable weapon, because as it stands, it's actually somewhat challenging to hit someone with the R2. You've seen me do it many times throughout this video, but it's not as common as you would expect. The hitbox for the R2, for the beam, is actually much narrower than it appears. The actual hitbox itself is only about as wide as your character, so the ends of the beam don't have an active hitbox. So what that means is your opponent doesn't necessarily need to dodge. They just have to strafe sideways, and that's enough to dodge it in most cases, which is kind of sad. And free aiming isn't even necessarily a good option to resolve that either, because there's no AoE to help you free aim, and it's still a relatively small hitbox. You need to be very precise with your aiming to make it work. So it's not really a good solution. And then on top of that, the fact that the windup for it is pretty darn slow and that there's a decent recovery as well means that it's telegraphed, so it's easy to dodge, and the recovery means that it's easy to punish. So overall, I don't feel like it's very good in comparison. And given the fact that there are other swords in the game that shoot out beams or wide area of effect things and have better movesets overall as well, just makes this one seem like it has fallen quite short in comparison to other weapons in its class. Comparing it to the Inseparable Sword, you on the Inseparable Sword have a much better moveset. You have a beam that's equally telegraphed, but actually is not any worse, to be perfectly honest. And that also applies a buff to the weapon. And then comparing it to the Golden Order Greatsword, same sort of deal, just no buff, but a wider area of effect that it shoots out. So at the end of the day, in comparison to other weapons in its own class, like I said, it seems to fall a bit short. The only saving grace is that those weapons are faith-based instead of intelligence-based. And yet if we compare it to an interesting intelligence-based greatsword, or something with at least some form of intelligence scaling in the form of the Death's Poker, you have much more interesting things going on with the skill, given that you have various combinations of how to use it once you put out your initial orb, and you have a better moveset overall as well. So really, the moveset on this one is quite limited. It doesn't really compare well to even the most recent version of it in Dark Souls 3, and that's a bit of a shame. Yes, the damage on this is great. The damage on it is spectacular, and you can one-shot people. But that's not going to happen very frequently, and at the end of the day, consistency is what's important, and this weapon just doesn't really have it, and doesn't live up to its namesake. But let me know what you guys think about it. Let me know if I was a bit too harsh on it, and let me know if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you all next time.